Delaware Governor Charles Terry was sitting at the dining room table alone, looking over policy documents. It was late in the evening, and the governor was winding down, sipping a glass of Bordeaux as he read. It was past midnight when his eyes began to grow heavy. Calling it a night, he emptied his glass, gathered up his papers, and pushed himself to his feet, starting for the luxurious bedroom of the 18th century Woodburn house. Governor Terry was almost out of the opulent dining room when he suddenly remembered that he had forgotten to do something. Turning around and walking back to the table, the governor grabbed a clean wine glass, uncorked the bottle of Bordeaux, and poured another glass of the rich red wine. That done, he walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, and crawled into bed, leaving behind the two wine glasses, one empty, one full. The first rays of sunlight spilling through the mansion's enormous windows the next morning illuminated both glasses, exactly where the governor had placed them. The only difference was that both glasses were empty. The year was 1966, and Charles Terry was the first Delaware governor to reside in the Woodburn house after it had been purchased by the state in 1965. The ghost haunting the magnificent Georgian mansion had been a staple in Delaware's folklore for over a century. But it wasn't until the house was declared the official governor's residence that new life was breathed into the old legend of the ghost of Woodburn. The legend began in 1790 when Charles Hilliard, a cantankerous patriarch who ruled his family of 10 children like a despot, financed the construction of Woodburn Mansion in Dover, Delaware. Very little flattering information has survived about Hilliard's character. Folklore has painted him as an eccentric tyrant who drank too much, delighted in the suffering of others, and demanded complete control over his children's lives. One account has him lounging in the Woodburn Great Hall with a bottle of fine wine, watching his 10 offspring closely as they stood barefoot on their tiptoes in front of him. He forced them to stand there for hours and whipped their feet with a riding crop when their toes finally lost strength and they fell back onto their feet. Another story has Hilliard chasing one of his sons, Charles Jr., through the grounds with a loaded pistol when the young man told him that he intended to move to New York and become a writer. Legend has it that in the chase around the gardens, Hilliard fired at his son several times, almost killing him on the front porch of the mansion. It is said that the young man would have certainly got a bullet in the head if he hadn't slammed the door behind him as he ran inside. He owed his life to the thick wooden door that stopped the well-aimed bullet from finding its mark. Workers renovating Woodburn in 1998 were stripping paint off the northern porch door when they discovered a small hole under the layers of paint that had accumulated over the years. The single perforation could have easily been a bullet hole, fired by an enraged father at his fleeing son. The bizarre occurrences that have long been reported in the mansion are definitely worthy of such a demented founder. Charles Hilliard made his first postmortem appearance in Woodburn in 1815, 1 year after he had passed away. His daughter Mary purchased the house with her husband, Dr. Martin Bates, after Mr. Hilliard passed on. From the very day they moved in, Mary struggled with a feeling that she was living under the disapproving eye of her father. It did not help that she often spied a figure moving in the periphery of her vision, a man in colonial dress wearing a powdered wig, knee-high breeches, and hose. Whenever she turned to look directly at the man hovering at the edge of her vision, he would vanish into thin air. He never remained long enough for her to get a good look, but the cold feeling in the pit of her stomach suggested that the presence was none other than the spirit of her father. Her fears were confirmed one dark fall morning when the Bates family was entertaining an itinerant clergyman named Lorenzo Dow. Mr. Bates, Mary, and Reverend Dow were in the dining room about to begin breakfast when Reverend Dow interrupted, asking if they weren't going to wait for the other guest. Mrs. Bates' stomach jumped into her throat. What other guest? Reverend Dow told her of the elderly man he had passed when he was coming downstairs for dinner. Mary was frantic. What did he look like? She asked. The description Reverend Dow gave matched her father identically. Years passed, and little was recorded about the elderly man who refused to leave Woodburn. Judge George Fisher was the owner of Woodburn over half a century later, in 1870, when the next bizarre occurrence was recorded in the folklore of the house. Judge Fisher's son, George Jr., who was home from college for Christmas break, had brought a friend home to stay for the holidays. It happened on the first night the two students were in Woodburn. Fisher's young friend was given the guest room, which had been Charles Hilliard's room years before. When the student walked into his room, he found the fireplace in full blaze. He was surprised because it was late and all the servants had retired some time before, but when his eyes caught the figure of a man reclining in the chair facing the fire, his heart jumped. The chair's back was facing him, so he couldn't be sure who was sitting in it, but the sudden wave of irrational fear that washed over the young man warned him that he was looking on something that wasn't of this world. His worst fears were realized when the figure suddenly leaned over the armrest and stared straight at him. It was an old man dressed in 18th century attire with a deeply wrinkled face the color of worn paper. The two stared at each other for seconds before the man's deathly pale face broke into a hideous grin. That was when the youngest guest screamed and fainted in fear. The room was completely dark when George Jr. rushed in after he heard his friend fall. He was puzzled by the story his friend told after he was revived, for there was no fire burning in the room, and nobody was sitting in the plush armchair before the fireplace. Strange happenings continued in the Woodburn house. Dr. Frank Hall, who lived in the house during much of the first half of the 20th century, was the first to notice the dead residents' appreciation for fine wine. Bottles of the house best were regularly found empty in the wine cellar, though the corks were intact and the seals unbroken. Governor Charles Terry was the first resident to actively accommodate the spirit of Woodburn's founder. Being told of Hilliard's taste for alcohol, he made it a habit to leave a glass of his finest red on the dining room table before he went to bed. Every morning, without exception, the glass would be found emptied. To this day, strange things continue to transpire at the Woodburn house. Workers who have been hired to do minor repairs have heard whispers coming from nowhere in the hallways. Security guards report the sound of footsteps in the front hall on the ground floor. Thorough investigations of the hall have never revealed the source of these phantom footsteps, even when they've been heard walking through the house several times in an evening. And then there are the stores of wine that continue to be emptied from Woodburn's cellar. It seems that the spirit of Hilliard has retained some memory of his terrestrial appetites long after the material form has ceased to be. Yet, given the relative benevolence of his hauntings, it might be said that the passage of years have his death assuaged the cruel nature he was infamous for while alive.